time, once thought to heal all, can actually be the enemy of truth. As days turn to decades, memories erode, facts are distorted, and critical details drift away as the hands of our clocks keep ticking. But as time has moved forward, for most of us, what is the fate of those who are still trapped by the past? Hi, I'm Dev.
And I'm Cam.
And you're listening to Criminalish, a true crime podcast where two best friends trade stories ranging from the wild and wacky to the downright messed up. So today I will be telling Cam about the murder of Hale Joyce Anderson, also known as Nikki Anderson, and Adrienne Hale, which took place in January of 1986 in Bremerton, Washington. Have you heard of this case before, Cam?
I think I have, but I don't remember the details. So I would love to hear the details from you.
That's great, Cam. But what's actually hilarious about this episode is I know you've heard this case before, because this is a case that I feel like in a lot of ways prompted the idea of us starting this podcast when we took our annual best friend trip to Miami back in 2023. If that's ringing any bells.
I do remember it, but I just clearly don't remember the details. Do continue to tell the listeners sort of how this prompted the beginning of the Criminalish podcast.
So I feel like this is the case that prompted the Criminalish podcast because I feel like you and I at the time had a very deep conversation about this whole case, about our stance and not only just the case itself, but also like the legal system and how everything was going about. And obviously I had always known that Cam was a true crime fan. She had always known that I was a true crime fan, but I just loved the depth of conversation we had. And I was like, what if we made other people listen to us talk about this stuff? Because we talked about this for a while. And for full transparency, I have already independently covered this case on my own podcast and YouTube channel. But as Cam does not remember the details of this case and the deep conversation we had around it, I figured this would be a great opportunity to circle back to this case that I find very interesting, very fascinating, and that I want to have a very good and deep discussion about.
I would agree. I have clearly listened to many true crime cases, done a lot of research for the cases we've covered on this podcast, and in the couple of years since we've had that conversation, the details of this case have left my brain.
All good, friend. All good, friend. But before we get into recalling all of those details, what you drinking?
So I honestly just came from the gym about an hour and a half ago. So next to me, I have my handy dandy gym water bottle. And that is what I'm drinking tonight because I have no other liquids, alcoholic or not, in my apartment. What about you? What you drinking?
So you may have just gotten back from the gym, but I got back from work not too long ago and they've been stressing me out, even though it's only Tuesday. I've had a very stressful time. So your girl is drinking some honey lavender stress relief tea in her boss lady mug because that's what we're about. This is my favorite mug because at the bottom it says, "I'm not bossy, I'm the boss."
Period.
Which we're speaking into existence because I hope to one day be my own boss. So y'all be sure to like, subscribe, and follow our podcast so I can be my own boss one day. Thank you.
I lied. The only other non-water liquid that I have in my apartment is tea, but it's caffeinated and it is 9 p.m. and entirely too late for me to be drinking caffeinated tea.
Exactly. Do you know how much we care about you guys at the Criminalish podcast? We're recording at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday for an episode that's supposed to come out on Friday. Don't ever question our loyalty and dedication to y'all.
And Devin really cares because she does the editing. So we're recording and she's about to edit and turn this episode around for y'all within a couple of days.
Right. And finally, as we get into today's case, I do want to extend trigger warnings for sexual assault as well as the murder of a very young child. And honestly, some parts of this case are going to be very difficult to hear and to talk about. So please keep that in mind as you continue to listen to today's episode. So to get into today's case, Helene Joyce Anderson, also known as Nikki Anderson, was born on October 15th, 1958 in Indiana. And while Helene was her given name, she pretty much exclusively went by Nikki, so I will be referring to her as Nikki for the remainder of this episode. And she was a beautiful young woman with a smile that radiated in every picture I saw of her. I didn't find much information about her childhood or early life, but Nikki has been described as a reliable, responsible, hardworking, careful mother who was devoted to her 2 children. And I quote, "To know her was to love her. She was like smelling the earth after a good rain." End quote. And I love that quote because if you've ever been outside after a good rain, specifically on a hike, on a mountain, something like that, the earth just smells heavenly, just smells lovely and fresh and clean and new. It is a very specific smell. And if you haven't experienced that smell, you should.
Agreed. It just reminds you that nothing is that serious. We are on this beautiful planet surrounded by beautiful people. And it really forces you to just stop and reflect on all of the great things that you have going on.
Absolutely. So while Nikki grew up primarily in Indiana, in the early 1980s, Nikki decided to move to Bremerton, Washington with her boyfriend, Kenny Hale, who was in the Navy at the time. If you're unfamiliar with this area, like I was, Bremerton is a small city in Washington state known for its naval bases and shipyard, and it sits on the Kitsap Peninsula, just an hour-long ferry ride away from downtown Seattle. So once the couple had settled into their new lives in Washington, Nikki and Kenny had a beautiful baby girl together, and they named her Adrienne Hale. She was born on November 9th, 1981, and Kenny has said of her, quote, "When she was 2, she was able to spell her name, Adrienne. Tears would just roll down my eyes that my baby was able to spell her name." End quote. Furthermore, he said, quote, "She was her own little person with her own little attitude and personality, and I'm just awed by it." End quote. And we need to give Adrienne her props because Adrienne is a long name for a 2-year-old. That's hard.
Right. And strangely enough, that is one of the facts that I do remember about this case, just because it is amazing that a 2-year-old could spell her name at that age, and a name like Adrienne that isn't super intuitive for a child who is just learning the language.
Absolutely. So shortly after Adrienne was born, Nikki and Kenny decided that they wanted to part ways romantically, but they remained very good friends and were active co-parents with their child. Kenny has actually been described as an incredible father who was dedicated to Adrienne and ensured that Nikki and her were taken care of despite the fact that they were no longer together. And Kenny spent a great deal of time at Nikki's house, which was a duplex in East Bremerton on Magnolia Drive. And as the years went on, Nikki got a job as a cook at Arby's to support herself, and she met someone new, another Navy man by the name of Ortha Tucker. And she and him would later have a handsome baby boy. By 1986, Nikki's second child was less than a year old. Adrienne was almost 4 years old. Nikki and Ortha were engaged, and all of them were planning to move to San Diego by the end of January. Nikki's fiance had been stationed at a new naval base, and the couple were getting ready to move all of them to San Diego. And by all accounts, Nikki was incredibly excited about this move and ready to begin her new life with her fiance. However, Nikki and Adrienne would never be able to make that move and begin the next chapter of their lives. On the evening of January 29th, 1986, Kenny had spent the evening with Nikki and Adrienne, which was common practice for them because, again, Kenny was a very active father in Adrienne's life. And by all accounts, Nikki and Kenny were great co-parents despite no longer being together. And as he prepared to leave the house at around 8:30 p.m., Adrienne asked if she could spend the night with Kenny instead of staying with Nikki. But as it was a school night and Adrienne was scheduled to go to preschool the following day, Kenny denied her request to spend the night with him, but promised to return the following day and spend more time with her, as him and Nikki lived relatively close to one another. So Kenny leaves their house, waving goodbye to his little girl who was looking out at him through the front window of the duplex. The following day, January 30th, 1986, Nikki was expecting some movers to return some furniture she had purchased in preparation for her move to San Diego. However, when the movers came, she didn't answer the door. And after a few minutes, the movers left a note on her door advising her to call them back later. However, before leaving the residence, the movers went and spoke to Nikki's neighbor. And they told this neighbor that they heard a baby crying so loud that it was concerning. And in response to this, the neighbor simply nodded and closed their front door. Some other individuals came to the residence as well, but again, Nikki never answered the door. Later into the evening, Kenny returns to the house ready to see his daughter once again. He knocked on the door, but again, Nikki didn't answer. While waiting for her to answer, he sees that there are several notes tacked to her front door. And after a few minutes with no answer from Nikki, Kenny decides that she must be out and he's just going to write her a note of his own. So the movers from earlier left a note stating that Nikki needed to contact them or there would be legal consequences. So Kenny takes that note, turns it over, and writes, quote, "Hey, you better call these guys. I stopped by about this time," end quote. He then sticks the note on the front door and begins to leave the residence. However, as he turned to leave, he hears an unsettling noise come from inside the house, and it's the small cries of a baby. He turns the doorknob, and surprisingly, the front door is unlocked, and Nikki never left her door unlocked. And as he walked into the house, he trips while making his way inside, only to reach down and realize that he had tripped over the leg of his 4-year-old daughter, Adrienne Hale, who lay dead and stiff in the front room of the apartment. And just a few feet away lay her mother, Nikki Anderson. As he stood there, and as the reality of what he had walked into sunk in, he hears the cries of a baby, the sound that had originally drew him into the house. And this baby is in a playpen and had been in that room with their mother and their sister's bodies for almost 24 hours before anyone had found them. Kenny then grabs the baby out of their playpen and ran to the neighbor's house to call the police. After calling the police, he then runs back into Nikki's house and attempts to give CPR to Adrienne while the police are on their way. The police would arrive to the scene at 9 p.m. on January 30th, 1986, and would also find Nikki and Adrienne's bodies in the front room of the apartment. They had both been strangled to death, and Nikki also suffered blunt force trauma, as well as some additional injuries that have not been disclosed to the public. But it has been revealed that there was evidence of sexual assault at the crime scene. It was estimated that Nikki and Adrienne had been dead for at least 18 hours before the police arrived. Thankfully, Nikki's baby was alive and unharmed, but a couch cushion from the living room couch was in their playpen, and it was later discovered that Nikki's blood was actually on the baby and in that playpen. So now it's time to get into the investigation. The house showed clear signs of a struggle, but there was no forced entry. In fact, the front door was unlocked when Kenny arrived, but the back door was locked and secured as usual. Based on the blood splatter and arrangement of the house, it became clear to the investigators that Nikki had attempted to fight her attacker and suffered some form of injury from an edged weapon. And it is believed that this injury led to Nikki's blood being in various locations around the house. Based on the lack of items stolen from the home and the lack of forced entry, it is believed that Nikki knew the person that attacked her, as her friends described her as an extremely careful person who kept her doors locked and would only open the door if she was expecting your arrival, which completely makes sense. She's a young woman with 2 small children. But despite the clear struggle at the scene, nothing appeared to have been stolen from the home, and as investigators began taking witness statements and conducting interviews, they found that, surprisingly, no one in the complex seems to have heard the struggle, especially as the walls in her 1986 duplex were extremely thin. So thin, in fact, that investigators could hear the conversation that was happening in the other duplex when they were investigating the case. Specifically, Nikki's neighbor and friend, referred to only as Pam, claimed she never heard anything alarming the night of the murders. And despite sharing a wall with Nikki and hearing every time her baby cried before this incident, she maintains that she heard nothing the night of the 30th. Throughout the investigation, Pam stated that the baby cried at times, but that was nothing new. And according to Pam, if she had heard screaming or some form of struggling, she would have said something, which personally I find suspicious because you managed to hear the baby crying every other time, but did not hear the brutal murder taking place next door. And while I might be willing to give you the argument that maybe Nikki didn't scream to not wake up her children or something like that, I refuse to give you the argument that Adrienne didn't. She's a terrified 4-year-old girl. I refuse to believe that she didn't make any noise and that she did not scream.
Also, I would say, yes, if somebody has a new baby, it makes sense that you would hear that baby crying from time to time. And even as a neighbor, you probably get used to it. But if people come to your apartment to let you know, hey, yeah, we tried to drop this thing off, the person didn't answer, and we hear a baby crying, and this is your friend and your neighbor who you know is very careful, cares so much about her children, is a responsible mother, why did alarm bells not start going off in your head when you knew that not only is this baby crying, but Nikki isn't coming to the door?
Exactly. Trust me, girl, we're going to get into Pam because I got a whole lot of questions for Mama. I got a whole lot of questions for her. So to circle back and talk about Adrienne, it is believed that she was sleeping down the hall when the attacker entered the home and was later woken up by the sound of the attack. It is believed that she went out to look for her mother to see what was making the noise, and based on where her body was found, it is believed that she may have saw what was happening and tried to run out the front door, but she never made it. And I think that's one of the most heartbreaking pieces of information I learned when looking into this case. And it hurts so much, especially because when you think about the fact that Adrienne asked to go with Kenny and not be with her mother the night that she died. And Kenny has actually said that this decision to not take Adrienne with him is one that haunts him to this day. And it's so sad that just a simple decision that makes perfect sense to not let your child stay with you because they have daycare the next morning and you have to get up early for work. To not want them to stay with you is a perfectly reasonable decision to make. And he feels in a way that that decision cost him his daughter. And that's a really sad state of being to be in. That really broke my heart when I was looking into this.
And that reminds me of one of the stories from the Ambarianos case, where the man who ended up killing her had a previous murder on his record where he killed an ex-girlfriend, and her 9-year-old son had come out and he also killed the son. And I think the only reason that her other child survived is because the child could not speak and would have no memory of this. And one, to murder anyone, you have to be deprived of a certain level of humanity. But to murder a child, I cannot imagine how soulless that person is. And it also makes me think that this is someone that Adrienne would potentially be able to identify as well.
That's exactly what I think. Because as morbid as it sounds, I think that's exactly right. I think the only reason Nikki's second child was able to live is because they couldn't identify who did this. And I'm not saying it would have been easy to, use a 4-year-old's statement to identify somebody. I guess it is possible, but like you're saying, it is a level of evil that I can't stomach. It's a level of, you have disassociated from reality to a point where it scares me. If you are capable of doing this, that is terrifying. And especially to strangle a 4-year-old to death. We've talked about it on this podcast before, but it takes a long time to strangle somebody. And especially to strangle somebody with your bare hands, it takes a long time. So not only did you take the 4 to 12 minutes it takes to strangle someone to death to her mother, you then turn around and do it to her. You looked a baby in their eyes as you took them off this planet. And that is so sick. It is so sick and twisted and evil. So now we're going to get into some suspects and some other evidence that has been released in this case. So one of the most eerie factors of this case is Nikki's second child. They were left unharmed, and there is actually evidence that they were moved to their playpen after the murders. But nobody really knows why. As we've previously stated, the killer is seemingly so cold-hearted that they can strangle a 4-year-old to death, but they move a almost 1-year-old to their playpen after brutally murdering their mother. And investigators believe that the child was moved after the murder because there was blood found on the nightie that the baby was wearing. The next piece of evidence that is pretty baffling in this case is the lack of forced entry into the home, and that seemingly no one heard anything at the crime scene. So this piece of evidence really leads me to believe that Nikki and Adrienne knew exactly who killed them. So after police have collected this evidence at the crime scene, they immediately start looking for suspects. And I'm sure you can guess that Kenny Hale is suspect number 1. And in all honesty, this is pretty standard operating procedure, as not only did he find the victims, but he has a close relationship to both of them, and he was supposedly the last person to see them alive. And it also doesn't help that his only alibi is that he was home with his girlfriend watching TV. And it is incredibly sad that it's just a fact that fathers murdering significant others and their own children is not necessarily an uncommon occurrence. And it also doesn't help that when you look at things statistically, 50% of children are killed by a parent or somebody that they know. However, in this case, as the investigation progressed, it is my opinion that the original officers on this case wanted so badly to put Kenny in jail for this crime, and they did not adequately investigate any other possibility or suspects. Kenny cooperated with the police from the very beginning. He gave them the shoes and the clothes he was wearing that night and sat for several interviews with the police, never gave conflicting information, and was always honest about where he was the last time he saw Nikki and Adrienne and what led him back to the house the day he found them. Also, I managed to watch a documentary on this case, and Kenny speaks in this documentary, the documentary that I was talking about at the top of this episode. And personally, I looked into this man's eyes as he talked about his story, as he talked about Adrienne and Nikki. And after doing that, I just cannot believe that he would ever do this to Nikki, but especially not do this to his daughter. And we would later find out that DNA processed at the crime scene nearly 30 years later completely ruled out Kenny as a suspect.
And I can't imagine how hard it is to have just lost a woman that you loved, even if they weren't romantically in love. I know that Kenny still had a lot of love for Nikki and your child. I can't imagine how hard it was to have just lost them. And now, of course, you expect the police are going to suspect you, but to be the main focus of the investigation, knowing that the resources they're putting into investigating you are taking away from investigations into other people who could have actually done it, man, I cannot imagine how hard that must have been and still is for Kenny, especially, like you said, the guilt that he feels, knowing that it was that one decision he made that night that cost his daughter her life.
Absolutely. It is completely unfair what happened to Kenny. And I'm going to go ahead and warn not only you, Cam, but our folks at home. We're going to get into what Kenny went through prior to the DNA coming out because it's a lot. So prior to that DNA evidence completely ruling Kenny out, Kenny was still suspect number one. And the police, in my opinion, were determined to put an innocent Black man in jail. And again, Kenny sat down for multiple interviews with the police. And in one interview, according to Kenny, they told him, and I quote, "You know you did this. Just admit you murdered your daughter and murdered Nikki," end quote. And you want to know what evidence the police were using to say that Kenny murdered his daughter and Nikki?
I probably don't, but please tell me.
Well, the police said that Nikki was going to move away with Kenny's child, and Kenny would have to start paying child support, which, and I quote, "looks like clear motivators for someone to do a heinous crime like this," end quote. I'm sorry, but if you're using child support as a motive to murder a woman and your child, that's it? That's it? That's your one? That's what you got?
Like, okay, I'll just trade the decades of grief for child support. That doesn't make any sense. That is just not a good enough reason to kill your child and the mother of your child, especially if that is the only evidence you have.
Right. And I'm just going to go ahead and say it. That sounds racist as hell. Because you're telling me that a Black man is going to throw his whole life away over child support? Child support. That's the flimsiest motive I've ever heard. I don't even want to call it a motive.
Right. And I'm like, by that logic, almost everyone could be a suspect. Because in most relationships, platonic or not, there might be things in that relationship that burden you in some way. But for most people, the burden is not great enough to make you take that person's life away.
Exactly. Especially when you look at the fact that Kenny and Nikki were great co-parents to the point where Kenny and Ortha had a good relationship. They used to go get dinner together. If you remember, Ortha is Nikki's new fiance. They had a good relationship together. So this also makes no sense in context of how Kenny is as a father, how Kenny is as an ex. Kenny sounds like a great baby daddy to me. If you had to pick a baby daddy, Kenny sounds like your man. He was there for his daughter. He wasn't interfering with Nikki's life when she decided to move on. And he made it a point to have a good relationship with her future husband. What more do you want from this man? And again, I don't want to harp on this too much, but this just pissed me off when I literally saw somebody have the audacity to say that this is a motive for the crime is child support. So despite completely cooperating with law enforcement, Kenny is still not believed. And in the end, Kenny agrees to take a polygraph test against the advisement of his family and friends. And just as Kenny is sitting down to take that polygraph, after he had been interrogated for over 8 hours without any food or water, there's a knock on the door. And someone alerted him that his attorney was there and that he was not going to take the polygraph test. And should the police need any additional statements from Kenny, they were going to have to go through his attorney. And Kenny left with his attorney that day. His family had actually gotten him counsel behind his back since he wasn't listening to their advice. Now, a portion of an interview that I watched in preparation for this case, the lead detective talked about how it was suspicious that Kenny put up a roadblock for investigators and wouldn't take this polygraph test. Thus, he must be being untruthful in some kind of way.
So the first thing is, y'all interrogated this man for 8 hours, no food, no water. He is not in the mental, let alone physical state to be taking a polygraph test. Because sometimes polygraph tests are built to pick up deception, but they can also pick up anxiety, extreme anxiety, or uncertainty. And if someone has gone 8 hours with no food, no water, on top of being accused of killing their child and the mother of their child, on top of the grief and confusion they're probably feeling themselves, I don't think that those results are going to be accurate. And on top of all that, it's not even admissible in court. And so I'm so glad that Kenny's family and friends got him counsel behind his back. I know for me, if I were ever in a position where I was being interrogated by police, I'm going to have a lawyer there with me. I'll answer y'all's questions, but my lawyer is going to be sitting right next to me because I don't trust y'all. Especially when they see a Black man and they assume he must be guilty.
Come on now. And you're completely right. Polygraphs are complete BS, in my opinion. They don't mean anything. All they show is that you have reacted in some way to something that you were asked. It basically measures your reactions, your stress on something, but you're already stressed out. So your baseline is stress. So anything is asked of you and you're going to react on this test. It's just very dumb to me. Again, we've talked about it on this podcast. I would never take a polygraph test. I could know good and dang well I didn't do the thing that I got dragged in for. And like Cam said, I am not talking to the police by myself, and I'm for damn sure not taking no polygraph exam. You can talk to my attorney. You can show me some evidence. We can get this thing going. Because at the end of the day, you have Miranda rights, but Miranda only works if you use her. If you don't invoke your rights, then the police are allowed to take everything you say and use it against you. And I understand where Kenny's coming from the perspective of like, I got nothing to hide, so of course I'm going to talk to the police. What do you mean I shouldn't talk to the police? Like, they're going to help me. They're going to find out who did this to the mother of my child and my child. They're trying to help me. So of course I'm going to talk to the police. He's talked about this in interviews, that he, as a young man who was in his early 30s at the time of this, had way too much faith in the police, had way too much trust in the police. Even growing up as a Black man in the 80s, he had too much trust and faith in the police. So after leaving with his attorney, according to Kenny, quote, after I walked out of the police department that day, I didn't hear anything from the Bremerton Police Department until like 10 years later, end quote. Despite the fact that Kenny had already sat down for your little interviews, had turned over all of his clothes, and all other items that y'all have just asked this man for. He's giving you everything. And he was never difficult with you all at all. And basically did everything you asked of him because y'all are bitter that you didn't get to go home after, in my opinion, forcing a man into a confession that didn't exist. Y'all don't give him any updates on what happened. Y'all don't talk to him. Y'all don't interact with him because best believe he was calling the police department. Y'all just weren't calling him. And I think that says a lot about the old investigation team. So despite the fact that police are fully convinced that Kenny was the one who killed Nikki and Adrienne, they have to continue investigating in order to find something so that they can bring him back in for questioning. So they go and they speak to Nikki's neighbor, Pam. That's right, we're circling back to this woman because in the words of Emily D. Baker, I have questions. So Pam knew before anyone else that the baby was crying next door and didn't say anything or go check on Nikki. And while you might be thinking, I don't know, I'm not that close with my neighbors, I probably wouldn't go knock on their door if I heard their baby crying. The difference between you and your random neighbor is that Nikki and Pam were friends. And people around the neighborhood described Nikki and Pam's relationship as, quote, very good friends, end quote. However, in her interviews with police, Pam described her and Nikki's relationship as acquaintances and not very friendly with one another, just neighbors. And allegedly, she was so nonchalant about the comment from the movers because it was common for one of Nikki's children to be, quote, fussy, end quote, at random times of the day. And I have lived next to people with small children. My neighbor had a baby while I was living next to them. So I know exactly how much an infant cries. And if I suddenly heard my neighbor's baby screaming all day, I'm going and checking up on them. We share a wall. You share a wall. I know you heard it. What's going on? Right? So the police aren't buying her story either. And when questioning her, they specifically ask, how did you not hear anything when you share a thin wall? And she claimed that she had an ear infection. And if she was laying down on the good ear, she wouldn't have been able to hear anything that was going on in the apartment next door. She then also added that she may have taken some nighttime medication in order to help her sleep.
I'm like, hypothetically, both of those could be true. But it's something where I'm like, that's interesting. Especially her offering up two different reasons for why she didn't hear anything.
You're right, it could be true, but I'm sorry, babes. It gives covering your tracks. It just does for me. Something about Pam is smelling real fishy. She acting real slick like the spray right now. I'm not feeling it. As the interview continued, police asked Pam to walk them through her evening, the night of the murders. And what police learned is that Pam is actually the last person to see Nikki and Adrienne alive, not Kenny. Based on Pam's statements, she would have had to have been in the home after Kenny left at approximately 8:30 p.m. on January 29th. Pam claimed that she saw Nikki around 9 p.m. And Pam says she never saw Kenny. And for what it's worth, Kenny says he never saw Pam. So police are kind of scratching their head about this information. And they realized that Pam never came forward when police arrived on scene. And she was not initially interviewed until after Kenny obtained an attorney. And I know that we don't have any actual proof that this woman did anything, but I just find all of her movements incredibly suspicious. And the way she acted post this murder makes no sense to me whatsoever. Because now you're the last person to see them alive. You ignored the baby crying all day the next day. You were told that the baby was crying and that Nikki didn't answer and you didn't react. You didn't care. You just closed your door and stayed in your house. You were home when the police and the ambulance and everything showed up. You never came outside. All of this is just mad weird. Mad weird, mama.
Agreed. We're not saying she did it. We're just saying her actions are suspicious.
Exactly. But while speaking to Pam, police ask her about any potential suspects or people in Nikki's life that might look to harm her. And Pam actually mentions a man by the name of Antoine. Antoine has been described as an acquaintance of Nikki's, but Antoine was actually dating Kenny's sister and had actually visited the house between the last time Nikki was seen alive and when Kenny returned to find the crime scene. According to Pam, Nikki was terrified of Antoine and did not want to be alone with him due to this fear. However, Nikki's friends stated that Nikki and Antoine had known each other for several years, and Nikki had offered him a place to stay when he was down on his luck. However, Antoine also had a history of domestic violence with an ex-girlfriend of his, which explains why he was reaching out to Nikki when he was down on his luck. So, on January 30th, about 2 hours before Nikki and Adrienne's bodies would be discovered, Antoine and another friend stopped by the duplex to look for Nikki. But, of course, Nikki didn't answer the door. When she didn't answer, they went over to Pam's door and asked her if she had heard from Nikki. And this is when Pam claims that she didn't hear anything and that she hasn't seen Nikki that day. They then asked a couple of other neighbors if they had heard from Nikki. And as more neighbors told them that they hadn't heard from her or seen her, they decided to leave the duplex. So after finding out that information, the investigators found and questioned Antoine as well as the person who he was with on that day. They do not get any specific evidence out of either of them, and there is no physical evidence that ties Antoine or this other friend to the crime scene. But there's also no evidence to exclude them from the crime scene either, as neither of them provide a viable alibi. And you want to know the craziest part about this case? Is that a few months after the murders, Antoine was convicted of a sexual crime against a child around the same age as Adrienne Hale. And as you can imagine, this pushes him back to the top of the list as far as suspects go for the police. But again, there is no evidence to indicate that he was the one who killed Nikki or Adrienne.
And I think this is one of those cases where two things can be true. One, Antoine likely did not take part in Nikki and Adrienne's murders. And two, he is still a disgusting human being.
Exactly. And you would be right, because once DNA at the crime scene became available, he was also ruled out as a suspect in the murders. And our final suspect in Nikki's case is her fiance, who was immediately ruled out due to him being on duty in San Diego at the time of the murders. And several witnesses at his base confirmed that he was on base at the time of the murders. And when DNA became available, he too was completely ruled out as a suspect. So, in the immediate aftermath of the crime, the case did not receive much media attention, despite the horrific crime scene that was found that night. And the case went cold rather quickly compared to other murder cases at the time. A few articles were published in the early stages of the investigation in local newspapers, but in my opinion, there was not nearly as much media coverage as there should have been for a double homicide, especially the double homicide of a mother and child. Detective Garland, the lead investigator of the case, said he feared that maybe the killings, quote, fell off the pages of the newspaper rather quickly, end quote, at the time because, quote, Nikki wasn't a white, blonde-haired cheerleader type. That tends to get more media coverage than a single mom and a woman of color. End quote. He continued his statement saying, quote, sometimes you can't help but bring in the color barrier. Sometimes I look back and say, what if that had been a white 4-year-old child? Would they have put a little more extra effort behind the investigation? End quote. After the first several weeks, the case eventually fell off the radar of investigators for years. That is until it was reopened in 1993, only for that renewed effort to fall flat. Over the years, several people of interest would be looked into for taking the lives of Nikki Anderson and Adrienne Hale, and this case would be re-examined in 1993, 2003, 2009, and 2019. And unfortunately, this case remains cold to this day. However, there is one piece of hope in this case, and that is in 2018, 32 years after the murders, the robe and the nightshirt Nikki was wearing the night of the crime was processed for DNA and came back with a strong, unknown male DNA profile around the neck of both of the garments, as well as the shoulders of the clothes. They were also able to match this DNA to other male DNA on an end table inside of the home where Nikki and Adrienne lived. Now, this is important because both Nikki and Adrienne's cause of death was manual strangulation, meaning the attacker used their hands to kill both of them. So if there is male DNA around the neck of Nikki's shirt, there's a strong possibility that that DNA belongs to her killer. However, this would be another dead end into the investigation because it would later be discovered that this male DNA actually belonged to Nikki's baby. And he would later be tracked down by investigators to have his DNA eliminated from the crime scene, since obviously he was less than a year old at the time of the murders. And I'm sure that was extremely frustrating for investigators, but imagine how heartbreaking that was for Kenny and for Nikki's family and for her child, who is now an adult, being called back in because they're told that there might be a breakthrough in their mother's case, only to find out that it's their DNA at the crime scene. However, 1 year later, investigators were able to collect a male DNA profile from within the crime scene, as well as on Nikki's nightgown. Ever since identifying this profile, police have been soliciting the names of people who may have been in Nikki's life and whose DNA has not been compared yet. And investigators have expressed that if they could just get a name to compare the DNA with, that they might be able to put to bed this horrific case and finally give the families closure.
And was this the DNA that Kenny, Ortho, and Antoine were also exonerated with?
And the especially interesting thing with Kenny is Kenny was over at the home quite often. He visited Adrienne almost every single day, and his DNA was in several places at the crime scene, but none of his DNA was on Nikki, which again completely exonerates him in this case, in my opinion. This case is incredibly sad, and this case, and without a doubt, the worst part about this case is the fact that it is still unsolved to this day. But I don't want to leave this case only talking about the murder of Nikki and Adrienne. I want to talk about who they were and how they lived. And at the time of her death, Helene Anderson, also known as Nikki Anderson, was only 27 years old, and Adrienne Hale was only 4 years old. Nikki was so young and she had so much to offer her children and wanted to be an outstanding mother to them. She was described as the type of person anyone would love. Adrienne was a happy, beautiful little girl, described as incredibly smart and had an attitude that was all of her own. Kenny continues to tell Nikki and Adrienne's stories to this day because he says, quote, "It gets kind of hard to go back and relive the story, but as long as I got air in my lungs and I am able to tell their story, I'll keep telling their story until I can't tell it no more." End quote. Kenny has gone on to have another child. I am unsure of his marital status, but I do know that he makes it a point to give that child the world. And this case really breaks my heart for all parties involved, but especially Nikki's second child, who was presumably in the home, watched her be murdered, and was left alone with their mother and their sister in that room with them. I just wish nothing but the best for this family, and I hope that they are all able to heal and that they are all safe. And I'm hoping that one day they all get the closure and justice of knowing what happened to Nikki and Adrienne. Detective Martin Garland from the Bremerton Police Department has worked at the police department for over 18 years and not only has worked extensively on this case, but he grew up in Bremerton, Washington. So the murders of Nikki and Adrienne have a very deep meaning to him. If you have any information, no matter how small you think it is, about Nikki Anderson or Adrienne Hale's unsolved murders, please call Detective Martin Garland at 360-473-5488. And that is the end of our story, friend.
And this is why cold cases are so hard to cover. And honestly, why I sometimes subconsciously and consciously shy away from them when picking cases for this podcast. Because not only are we left with the tragedy of losing Nikki and Adrienne, but we also don't know who caused it. So there's this feeling of this person could still be walking among us, walking around free with no consequences for what they did. And that fact is so scary. But as Kenny said, it is so important to continue to tell their story because there could be little things, because there could be something that in one person's mind is the tiniest, most inconsequential fact, but it could be the thing that breaks this case wide open. Or there could be a family secret that's been kept for decades, and it's time for that secret to be revealed. But Dev, I thank you so much for telling this case again. I remember why this was the case that prompted us to start talking about starting a podcast, because I had so much to say about this, and I still have so much to say now. My heart breaks for Nikki, her family, her loved ones, and Kenny's family and his loved ones, because their deaths had just a ripple effect across their entire community. And I know we didn't talk much about Nikki's fiance, but I feel for him too, because they were planning on starting the next chapter of their lives. And that was just completely taken away from him. And just a final thought on what Kenny had to go through as a suspect and what could have happened if his family had not gotten him counsel. Kenny could be in prison today for this. Kenny could have been in prison until 2019, when the DNA would have finally proven that he did not commit these horrendous crimes.
But the saddest part about that, Cam, is in some cases, the DNA is not enough to get you out of prison. So there's not even a guarantee that his DNA not being on Nikki's body would be enough to get him out of prison. Yeah, friend, I kind of feel the same way because this case is sad. This case is heartbreaking, and this case is so heinous. And to not know who did it is so unsatisfying. And we as people like when things make sense, like when things have clean endings. But I think it's so important to talk about stories like this because, again, the police have said if we can just get a name, we can start comparing DNA. We can set up the family tree. We can find something if we can just get a name. But also, at this point too, in order to get somebody's DNA, unless they willingly give it to you, they need a subpoena from court. And we just think they did it is not enough to get that subpoena in court in 2024. It might have been enough in 1986, but it's definitely not enough now. So the main thing is to think about that information. All information in this case is important. If your favorite drunk uncle says something funky at the cookout and you feel the need to call Detective Garland about it, you call Detective Garland. Any information is important, especially in a cold case that's this old. And I want to see justice for a Black woman. I want to see justice for a Black baby. I want to see justice for a Black man.
So as we wrap up today's discussion, we are going to move into our segment called Today in Crime, where we'll describe a crime or crime-related event that took place on this day. So on October 4th, 2011, Michael Morton, who spent 25 years in prison for his wife's murder, is released after DNA evidence implicates another man in the crime. The prosecutor in the case later was accused of withholding evidence indicating that Morton was innocent. On the afternoon of August 13th, 1986, a neighbor found 31-year-old Christine Morton beaten to death in her bed in the Williamson County, Texas home, which is near Austin, that she shared with Michael and their 3-year-old son. 6 weeks later, Morton, who had no criminal record or history of violence, was arrested for Christine's murder. At trial, the prosecution contended Morton had slain his wife of 7 years after she refused to have sex with him on the night of August 12th, his 32nd birthday. Morton maintained he had nothing to do with his wife's death and said an intruder must have killed her after he left for work early on the morning of August 13th. No witnesses or physical evidence linked Morton to the crime. Nevertheless, he was convicted on February 17, 1987, and sentenced to life behind bars. In 2005, Morton's defense team asked the state to test DNA on a variety of items, including a blood-stained bandana found by police the day after the murder at an abandoned construction site close to the Morton home. The Williamson County District Attorney successfully blocked all requests for testing until 2010, when a Texas appeals court ordered that testing on the bandana took place. In the summer of 2011, the test results revealed the bandana contained Christine Morton's blood and hair, along with the DNA of another man, Mark Allen Norwood, a felon with a long criminal record who worked in the Austin area as a carpet layer at the time of the murder. Michael Morton was released from prison on October 4th, 2011, and officially exonerated in December of that year. A month after Morton was freed, Norwood, who is 57, was arrested for Christine Morton's killing. In March 2013, he was found guilty of her murder and sentenced to life in prison. Based on DNA evidence, Norwood was also indicted for killing a second woman, Deborah Baker, whose 1988 murder in Austin had remained unsolved. Like Morton, Baker was bludgeoned to death in her bed. She lived just blocks from Norwood at the time of her murder. In October 2012, after a nearly year-long investigation, the State Bar of Texas filed a disciplinary petition against Ken Anderson, the prosecutor in the Morton case, who became a Texas district judge in 2002, alleging he withheld various pieces of evidence from Morton's attorneys, including a transcript of an August 1986 taped interview between the case's lead investigator and Morton's mother-in-law, in which she stated that Morton's 3-year-old son had told her in detail about witnessing his mother's murder and said his father was not home at the time. In a November 2013 deal to settle the charges against him, Anderson agreed to serve 10 days in jail, perform 500 hours of community service, give up his law license, and pay a $500 fine. And that is what took place on this day in crime. If you found this story interesting, leave a DNA emoji in the comments. 25 years.
I was just about to say, 25 years of a man's life and it came down to a $500 fine? Oh, you lost your law license. You apparently should have lost that 25 years ago, so.
Exactly. And I can't imagine the types of decisions you were making as a judge if that's how you go about prosecuting a case. 25 years he missed of his life, of his son's life. 25 years he wasn't able to properly grieve his wife's death.
Exactly. On top of the fact that not only was it 25 years of his life, but you barred it the first time around. So it didn't even have to be 25 years of his life. It could have still been 20. That's still 5 years that he could have had outside of jail. But in my opinion, you only block things and bar things because you know you're wrong.
What valid reason would there have been to block testing on a potential piece of evidence?
Exactly. In my opinion, in my humble opinion, the only reason that you would block the testing of this evidence is because you know this evidence is going to blow your case up.
Right. And that's a key example of someone caring more about their career than someone else's life.
Come on now.
Actually, than multiple people's lives. Because had you been doing your job, Deborah Baker would still be alive today. And thank goodness this man hopefully did not kill more people.
And it's crazy that we have to say that we know of.
Right.
That's crazy. Any other thoughts, friend?
Nope, that's all I got.
Thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode. I'd also like to thank It's the Mystery for Me podcast, as well as Cosmic Bigfoot, for providing most of the material for this episode. If you'd like to check out photos related to this case, be sure to follow us at Criminalish Podcast on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube.
Listeners, if you like what you hear, be sure to tell a friend and leave us a 5-star review wherever you're listening to the Criminalish podcast. And if you are listening on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to our channel and feel free to leave any comments or questions. As always, stay nosy, my friends. Bye.